Spiritual formation. What is it? A well-known definition of Christian spiritual formation by Barry and Connolly is the following. Christian spiritual formation is help given by one Christian to another, which enables that person to pay attention to God's personal communication to him or her, to respond to this personally by communicating with God, growing in intimacy with this God, and living out the consequences of the relationship. To understand the process of Christian spiritual formation does not seem difficult, at least not on a broad brush level. Concisely, it involves an experiential awareness of God's presence that leads to conversation, communion, and ultimately authentic transformation of the entire person by an internal yielding to His will. What is difficult to grasp, however, is why it is so easy to miss experiencing the ocean of divine love for all the water. Believing that spirituality is vital for growth and essential for dealing with life's problems, many individuals are pursuing a journey of spiritual growth. Pursuing this journey involves a commitment to engage in spiritual practices such as prayer and meditation. As a result of this pursuit, some individuals are finding their lives more centered and fulfilling, while others find themselves trapped in old feelings, attitudes, and habits that appear to undo their progress. Even those who have made progress on their journey often encounter spiritual and psychological roadblocks to growth. But fewer are approaching the institutional church for help with these concerns. Why is this? Presumably because of the spiritual homelessness, the experience of no longer feeling at home in one's religious tradition or with ministry personnel. Gene Stairs describes the phenomenon as the world is crying out for the church to be more like the church, to represent the space and place where holiness, meaning, and God can be found, understood, experienced, and reimagined. Because of the extent of spiritual homelessness, it should not be surprising that many are turning to psychotherapy rather than to ministers for spiritual advice. And many who are already in psychotherapy expect that therapy will focus on their spiritual concerns. Like spiritual formation, Christian counseling can and does address spiritual concerns and issues. Beyond this commonality, the two modalities differ about the type of clientele served, goals and purposes, the nature of the relationship with the professional, and the type of interventions used. Spiritual formation is also known as spiritual guidance, spiritual friendship, and spiritual companionship. There are various ways of defining spiritual direction in the Christian tradition. Definitions span the gambit from spiritual formation is the application of theology to the life of prayer, to spiritual formation, or the cure of the souls, is seeking after the leading of the Holy Spirit in a given psychological and spiritual situation. It is noteworthy that two themes, life of prayer and seeking after the leading of the Holy Spirit, are reflected in many of the descriptions of spiritual formation. The clientele that may be most responsive to spiritual direction are relatively healthy spiritual seekers. Nevertheless, Spiritual formation is quite inclusive, and many writers contend that spiritual formation is appropriate for most Christians. However, some would limit spiritual formation to those who possess a moderate degree of psychological health and well-being. Unlike Christian counseling, which focuses more on symptom reduction and problem resolution, spiritual formation focuses principally on the development and maintenance of spiritual health and well-being. The basic goal of spiritual direction is to develop the directee's relationship with God. Because prayer is critical to this relationship, the directee's prayer life is a major consideration. This includes both discursive and meditative or centering prayer. Spiritual formation involves a trained director who guides or companions another person, often called a directee, listening to that person's life story with sensitivity to the movement of God in the directee's life. The relationship that develops in spiritual direction differs from the type of relationship established in psychotherapy and pastoral counseling. For one, the relationship in Christian spiritual formation is triadic, involving the director, the directee, and the Holy Spirit. For another, the relationship between directee and director is primarily a mutual collaboration. Interventions in spiritual direction include instruction in prayer, prescription of rituals, and other spiritual practices. When indicated, spiritual directors may refer directees with psychological problems for concurrent psychotherapy, or suspend spiritual formation until a course of therapy is completed. Whether one professional can effectively and appropriately provide both spiritual formation and psychotherapy is a matter of considerable debate. The phenomenon of spiritual homelessness may restrain some people from seeking spiritual formation from spiritual directors within institutional church ties. Even if pastors were to wholeheartedly embrace the role of spiritual counselor, it's unlikely they could be expected to deal adequately with the complex psycho-spiritual issues. So this means that persons seeking spiritual advice are likely to have greater access to spiritually sensitive psychotherapists than to spiritual directors. And they can expect that psychotherapists who are sensitive to spiritual issues will have more specialized training in dealing with complex psychological problems that have spiritual aspects than most spiritual directors. Because of this, spiritually sensitive psychotherapists have a distinct advantage over spiritual directors without formal training in psychotherapy. This factor cannot be underplayed for clients who have experienced early life traumas, have a substance or drug abuse history, or are struggling with significant stressors and conflicts, and who are seeking spiritual advice. Thus, it does not seem unreasonable to conclude that psychotherapists sensitive to the spiritual dimension, with adequate training, could reasonably address the spiritual concerns of their clients. But how can the practice of psychotherapy become more receptive and effective in dealing with spiritual issues or concerns? One proposition is that psychotherapy can become more receptive and effective by incorporating some or all of the spiritual functions in spiritual formation. There are various functions performed by or involved in the spiritual director and the directee. 8 such functions, some of which have their counterparts in Christian counseling. The spiritual director's functions include spiritual assessment, differentiating spiritual experience from psychopathology, triadic relationship, advisement, discernment, spiritual resistance, and transference and countertransference. Some unusual and troubling spiritual experiences can arise during the spiritual journey, and clinicians need to be able to differentiate such experiences from major psychopathology. New realms of spiritual experiences can appear suddenly, dramatically, leading to intense confusion, anxiety, and sometimes impaired functioning. Persons with no obvious personal vulnerability or family history of mental illness may wonder if they're experiencing psychosis or psychotic symptoms. Not surprisingly, mystical experiences such as visions have been misdiagnosed as psychosis, just as dark night experiences have been misdiagnosed as depressive disorder. Transformation, perhaps, is the central issue and goal of spiritual formation. It is the process of undergoing a radical change of the mind and heart, a dying to the false self and continually assenting to one's true self, which reflects the image and likeness of God. Transformation is a lifelong process. Coming under spiritual formation is one means of developing one's relationship with God. Essentially, spiritual formation is a relationship among three persons: God, the directee, and the director. The relationship between the directee and the director can be instrumental for the development of the relationship of the directee and God. But the latter relationship exists prior to and is independent of the former. The directors do not create relationships between God and their directees. They try to foster such relationships. In pursuit of the goal of transformation, a spiritual director focuses on the advising the directee about the life of prayer and the use of spiritual practices. Advice and instruction on prayer and meditation are key methods of spiritual formation. Typically, such advice arises out of questions and concerns brought up by the advisee. Given the context of mutual collaboration, advisement comes in the guise of suggestion rather than firm directives. Discernment is the function of spiritual formation concerned with seeking after the leading of the Holy Spirit. In the past, directors typically discerned spirits and major life decisions for their directees. Tilton Edwards notes that discernment in the Roman Catholic, Anglican, and mainstream Protestant church practice of spiritual formation today has shifted from director to the directee, or to a kind of mutual discernment between them. Now directors listen with the directee for what God's Spirit seems to be up to, asking probing questions, perhaps offering suggestions, and above all, providing a supportive, prayerful presence for deep listening. They see themselves as co-discerners with the directee. Three forms of resistance in spiritual formation have been noted: resistance to the spiritual experience, resistance to the spiritual director or to spiritual formation, and the director's resistance to directees or their religious experience. The first form of resistance involves avoidance of religious or spiritual experience itself. The form of resistance in directees depends on their psychological makeup, and their particular psychological defenses they habitually employ in other areas of their lives. The second form involves resistance to the spiritual director or to spiritual formation. It may develop in response to the director's ineptitude, lack of attentiveness, judgmental attitude, or abusiveness. The third form involves the director's avoidance of something in the spiritual formation process. Dreading dealing with an issue that must be confronted, the director may forget the appointment or arrive late, or the director may be discouraged at the directee's lack of progress. Transference is an unconscious projection of the directee's positive or negative expectations onto the director. Since spiritual formation tends to be scheduled monthly, whereas dynamically oriented psychotherapy may be timed twice weekly, directors may assume that because spiritual formation is less intensive, transference is unlikely to develop. Because spiritual formation focuses primarily on the directee's relationship with God rather than the director. Directors may seldom need to engage transference directly. It shouldn't be surprising that countertransference also occurs in spiritual formation. Since countertransference is elicited by the directee and is reciprocal, director resistances in spiritual formation are part of his or her countertransference. Needless to say, managing transference and countertransference in spiritual formation requires considerable skill. Those practicing spiritual formation who also have formal training in psychotherapy presumably have an advantage in dealing with such transferences. Through supervision and psychological consultation, directors with less training and experience can learn to manage transference and their own reactions to directees. Integrating spiritual formation functions into the process of psychotherapy may seem rather straightforward and uncomplicated. However, incorporating the spiritual formation functions requires some major changes in the therapeutic process. These changes are not just different types of interventions, but differences in relationship, focus, and stance. Not only is the working relationship in spiritual formation triadic instead of dyadic, as in psychotherapy, the spiritual director is a companion or fellow traveler on the same spiritual journey as the directee. Spiritual formation's focus on prayer and the directee's ongoing relationship God is considerably different from the psychotherapeutic focus on symptoms, problems, or personality change. Beyond these relationship, focus, and stance differences is the basic question: should spiritual formation functions be incorporated within psychotherapy? Three different perspectives or points of view on this question deserve careful consideration: the positive perspective, the negative perspective, and the negotiated perspective. The positive perspective endorses the incorporation of many or all the spiritual formation functions. This perspective is advocated by practitioners and supporters of various spiritually oriented psychotherapies. Training, prescribing, and advising about meditation, among other spiritual practices, in the context of psychotherapy has been normative for most transpersonal psychotherapies over the past 4 decades. While many transpersonal approaches in psychology are not overtly Christian in orientation, they appear to have successfully and effectively combined many spiritual formation functions along with psychotherapy functions within the work of the spiritually oriented psychotherapist. While the clients may also be involved with a meditation teacher or group, many, if not all, the spiritual formation functions are performed by their psychotherapist. The negative perspective is championed by Gerald May, who is both a psychiatrist and a spiritual director. He has definite opinions about the roles and functions of spiritual formation and psychotherapy, and he refrains from combining the two roles or functions in his practice. Presumably, he would not favor spiritually oriented psychotherapies, combining functions and roles of psychotherapy and spiritual formation. Dr. May believed that psychotherapists must be sensitive to the spiritual domain in their work. He contended it is inappropriate to make spirituality the primary agenda of psychotherapeutic consultation. Only when a psychotherapist is a gifted spiritual director, if a clear discernment has been made with the person as the rightness of the relationship, and only on a temporary basis where Dr. May sanction a helper's taking on both roles. Dr. May supports this position with the following reasons. First, he insists that it is an unwise economy of time and emphasis, noting that clients want to use their session time to deal with their problems and difficulties, leaving little time for spiritual formation functions. Second, May believes that it is difficult for both client and helper to shift back and forth between the more analytic process of psychotherapy and the very reflective stance and pace of spiritual formation. He says you and the client somehow have to shift your attitudes away from problem solving toward more prayerful openness, and that is not always easy. While spiritual formation and psychotherapy share some commonalities, they are far from being interchangeable. Integrating spiritual formation functions into psychotherapy does not have to be an all-or-nothing proposition. Either integrate all 8 functions or don't incorporate any. At least 2 integration strategies are possible. The first strategy is to incorporate most of the 8 spiritual formation functions into the psychotherapy process. Psychotherapists who are likely to use this strategy typically have participated in their own spiritual formation with an experienced director. They also experience a strong desire and feel called to offer spiritual formation. Moreover, these psychotherapists have clients who want spiritual formation provided in the context of their psychotherapy. Lastly, these psychotherapists have been able to arrange scheduling and fees so that the spiritual formation functions can be sequenced with psychotherapy functions. For example, a client who is seen weekly, the therapist may schedule 1 session a month devoted principally to spiritual formation concerns, while the other sessions that month are devoted primarily to psychotherapeutic concerns. A second strategy is to incorporate only 2 or 3 of the spiritual formation functions into psychotherapy. Many psychotherapists are interested in providing psychotherapy that is sensitive to spiritual issues, but cannot easily incorporate more than a couple of spiritual formation functions in their therapy. The 2 spiritual formation functions that are most easily incorporated are spiritual assessment and advisement. Spiritual assessment is essential for a therapist who endeavors to offer spiritually sensitive psychotherapy.
Even a brief assessment can reveal the client's current spiritual practices, image of God, past and present religious and spiritual concerns. Based on this assessment, the therapist, in collaboration with the client, can choose to focus therapeutically on the issue that has a spiritual meaning. They can refer the client to a minister or other spiritual guide, or consider a spiritual practice. Advisement may involve the therapist prescribing and monitoring certain spiritual practices, then offering advice and feedback in the process. Spiritual practices are focused activities that foster spiritual qualities and can result in a balanced, disciplined lifestyle. Whether used as an intervention within a treatment session or a prescribed intercession activity, spiritual practices can be a powerful adjunct to the treatment process. A fascinating trend has been noticed in the past few years. Clients are seeking to deal with spiritual issues and concerns in the context of psychotherapy. This phenomenon has increased interest in the spiritually oriented psychotherapies. Not surprisingly, clinicians with an interest in the spiritual dimension are considering how they might respond to this need.